And our presenter this month is our very own Ranger Michael Putnam. He's going to be talking about our Scottish heritage here in Darien and the Scottish Highlanders who settled the town of Darien. And this is our third tricentennial speaker series presentation of the year. I've been doing these throughout the year in celebration of our 300th anniversary. Fort King George was founded in 1721. Of course, now in 2021, that was 300 years ago. So we've been celebrating all of our wonderful, the 300 years of history that has been going on in this area since then, with a series of presentations throughout the year about different topics relating to local history. And this month we have our very own Ranger Michael Putnam, who works here at Fort King George. He's doing our presentation on the Scottish Highlanders who settled Darien. And March is actually Scottish Heritage Month here in Darien. And in lieu of our typical Scottish Heritage Days reenactment that we would do one weekend in March, we've done several smaller programs throughout the month, and we're wrapping up with this topic for this month's speaker series presentation. So we're pretty excited to get into this topic. It's something that's near and dear to a lot of our hearts. And to reiterate a bit of housekeeping for anybody who missed that earlier, who's new, any questions that you have, if you're watching from Facebook Live, you can type that in the comments, or if you're watching from Zoom, down at the bottom, there's a chat button. You can click that and type the questions in there. And we'll be looking at those throughout the presentation, and we will answer them at the end. So yeah, just type any questions that you have in the comments or in the chat. And there will also be a brief survey that pops up. This series has been made possible by a grant that was granted to us through the Georgia Humanities, and they asked that we have a poll to gather some data and some feedback from those that are watching. So if that poll pops up, if you don't mind answering those questions, we'd really appreciate it. And yeah, before we get started, I would just like to talk up our speaker, Ranger Michael, a little bit. He was born and raised here on the Georgia coast and has long been fascinated with our local history. He has a BS in anthropology from Georgia Southern University, and that's where he got started in his learning about Scottish history and linguistics, from all the cultures and languages from the Highlands and the islands of Scotland. He started working here at Fort King George in February of 2019 as our part-time naturalist. And since then, he has promoted to be our full-time maintenance ranger. So he really is a Renaissance person. He has expertise in a wide variety of things. I appreciate him and his expertise immensely, both on a professional and a personal level. He's a great asset to the Fort King George team. Since he's been here, he's run and developed several of his own programs. He's done a sorely needed complete inventory of our sawmill display in our museum. So that's been really nice to see all of those tools properly archived, and he's working on making some little interpretive panels for them. So that's going to be a really great addition to our museum. He's also been a tremendous help in adjusting our operations to adhere to the COVID guidelines throughout the past year or so. And really, he's just helping keeping the site running. So we really appreciate him around here. I'm really glad he gets to share some of his passion with you today. This is a topic that he really enjoys and has a lot of knowledge on, and that you all get to learn from his wealth of knowledge. So without further ado, I'll let you take it away, Michael.
Okay, don't get your expectations up too high because that was way too much talking up. So like Ranger Ali said, my name is Michael Putnam. I have been a ranger here for about 2 years at Fort King George. And I am really excited to be presenting today about the Highland settlers here in Darien and along the Georgia coast. I do want to say that we could not have done this project without help from Georgia Humanities. We've been supported by the Georgia Humanities in partnership with the Georgia Department of Economic Development and through funding of the Georgia General Assembly, which has been a major help as far as getting other speakers in here who are experts in their own respective fields. I'm going to go ahead and get us started here. if my slideshow will start. There we go. All right, so the topic today, or the name of the presentation today, is More to the Story, Darien's Highland Settlers. We're going to be talking today about why the unique culture of the Highland Scots made Darien a successful colonial society, even in the face of extreme hardships and war. We're going to go a little bit, we're going to start way before the settling of Darien and carry through until after the trustee period of the Georgia colony. We will be going over not just who the settlers of Darien were, but why they came here, what drove them out of Scotland to come to the Georgia coast. So, let's start with a little bit of context. So in 1685 here on the slideshow, we can see that Friedrich Handel and Johann Sebastian Bach are both born. This is the same year that James II and VII comes to power. And we'll talk about why that's important in just a few minutes. In 1714, George I becomes the King of England, just a year before the very first breech-loading weapon was made, which is what we think of as a modern gun, where you load the projectile from the side rather than having to put everything down the barrel itself. 1715 is also the year of the very first Jacobite Rising, and we'll explain, or not the first Jacobite Rising, one of the first major Jacobite Risings. And we're going to talk about that as well, because those are extremely important to the history of Darien and the Scottish Highlanders here. Fort King George was, of course, here from 1721 to 1727. In 1727, the last year of Fort King George is the same year that King George II takes over in England after his father passes away. And then in 1732, which is the same year that the city of Savannah is settled, the first city in the colony of Georgia, the very first Poor Richard's Almanac is published, and George Washington is born. That probably puts it in context better than just about anything else as to what we're looking at as far as what's typically seen as American history versus the previous years that get missed a lot. 1736 is the founding of the town of New Inverness, which would become Darien as we know it today. It's also the same year that Patrick Henry, the founding father, was born, and the year that the future King George III will get married to Princess Charlotte. In 1740, which is the same year as the slaughter at Fort Mose, is the year that Beethoven's father is born. We think about these classical musicians as living so long ago, but we're actually going to be talking about an entire generation before Beethoven. 1742, Don Quixote is first published in English. It's also the year of the Battle of Bloody Marsh, the year that the War of Jenkins' Ear comes to a standstill here in the southern part of the New World. And in 1745, when Chief Justice John Jay is born, that marks the year of the final major Jacobite Rising. So why would anyone leave Scotland? Well, there are three major reasons that drove these Highlanders out of their native land. The first were the consequences of the Jacobite Risings. We'll talk about what is Jacobitism and what a Jacobite Rising really is. But there's also the factor of the changing economy of the Highlands. There was a major shift from one economy style to another in the same time period. And finally, there were several cultural and societal changes that coincided those things and were caused by and caused those things at the same time. That all of those factors added together are what drive the Highlanders here to Darien. So you could run entire college classes on just Jacobitism and the Jacobite Risings. So I'm going to give you the very brief history of Jacobitism, hopefully. So the idea of Jacobitism begins with this guy. Well, really it begins with this guy, who's James I and the VI, but we're not going with him today. So this is James II / 7th. He is the second King James of England. He is the 7th King James of Scotland. He rules from 1685 to 1688. he was not supposed to be king. He was the second son, he was a Catholic, and he was older for the time period. He was seen as a temporary king, kind of a formality. He's the very last Catholic monarch in all of England. And he comes to the throne with no male heir. He's older, but he'd been recently remarried. And in 1688, while he's already serving as king, he has a son. That causes a crisis in England. They do not want a Catholic monarch and a continuation of a Catholic monarchy in the very Protestant England at the time. So this leads to what is called the Glorious Revolution. King James II/7 is deposed, and in his place, they put co-regents, a king and queen ruling together. They're often known together as William and Mary. Mary is actually the daughter of the previous king, James II, but she's from the first marriage, so she was raised a Protestant. She married William of Orange, who was a ruler in his own right in the Netherlands and in Spain. The two ruled jointly in a very strange situation in England. This is the only time co-regents have ever been recognized. However, they produced no heirs. Mary died fairly soon. William reigned for another 5 years or so after Mary died. But most prominently, one of the biggest effects of the reign of William and Mary was they signed a law which prohibited any king or queen of England to practice the Catholic faith. Keep that in mind. That's a big thing. So after William dies, they have no heirs. It goes on to James's next daughter, Queen Anne. Queen Anne, again, is a Protestant daughter of the first marriage of James II/7. Queen Anne, by all accounts, had a very successful rule. One of her biggest achievements is she oversaw what are called the Acts of the Union, which unified the kingdoms of England and Scotland into a single nation. She, however, also dies with no heir. And with her dies the line of the Stuart kings. The Stuart kings is another way of talking about all of these other rulers that I've already spoken about. When she dies, there is a bit of a crisis as to who will take over the throne. She has a lot of family, including a younger half-brother who was the son of James II and 7th. However, due to the law that was signed by William and Mary, there cannot be a Catholic ruler in England. So by skipping over nearly 20 closer relatives, a German prince named George takes over. He becomes King George I and the namesake of Fort King George. He takes over in 1714. That really enrages this guy. This is James Francis Edward Stuart. He is the son of James II, who was born in 1688, leading to the Great Crisis and the Glorious Revolution. Oftentimes, he is given the nickname of the Old Pretender. In fact, the name Jacobite or Jacobitism comes from the name James. The Latin version of James is Jacobus. So the leaders of the movement to try and bring the Jameses and the Stuarts back to the throne were known as Jacobites. And then we have the Bonnie Prince, Charles Edward Stuart, also called sometimes the Young Pretender. This is the son of James Francis Edward Stuart. The Bonnie Prince and James Francis Edward would both come back to England in attempts to place themselves back on the throne. However, the Bonnie Prince Charlie was probably the one who was the most favorite of the Scottish Highlanders and is the one you'll often hear the old Jacobite songs and see depicted from the Risings. So, I mentioned the risings. There were a lot of them. We're going to talk about some of the major Jacobite risings. A rising is an attempt of a rebellion, whether it was an open battle or, as you'll see, there are also just assassination plots that are considered risings. But the first one happens in 1689, just a year after James is deposed. It's the, like I said, very first of the risings, and it pits the Jacobites against the Kingdom of Scotland. Again, at this point in time, Scotland and England have not yet been united. So the Kingdom of Scotland has to deal with the Jacobites. This one also spilled over into Ireland. There is a huge Jacobite rebellion in Ireland as well. It officially ends in 1691 when the Kingdom of Scotland buys off all the Jacobite chiefs. They pass a huge bribe over to convince them to switch sides, or at least to lay down arms. But that doesn't stop all of the skirmishes. One of the major accomplishments in the 1689 rising was the construction of Fort William. Fort William is in the Highlands of Scotland. It was considered the center of command for the British Army in the Scottish Highlands, and it's massive and not very far from Inverness. Now, I said that the 1689 rising officially ends in 1691, but that's not necessarily true, because it truly ends in 1692 with what are called the Glencoe Massacre, or what's called the Glencoe Massacre. In this event, in a small area of Scotland called Glencoe, about 30 members of Clan MacDonald were killed by government agents for refusing to sign an oath of allegiance to William and Mary. They fled and were pursued by British troops, and Campbell's acting on behalf of British troops, depending on who you ask, and were slaughtered. Most of them were unarmed, and it is still remembered today. And in fact, usually in normal times, we have members of Clan Donald who come here to Fort King George in a remembrance of the Glencoe Massacre. Now, the next major rising is in 1715. And it's important enough that it gets its own slide. So the Rising of the 15 starts off on a bad note. After the rising officially begins with a few of the lords declaring themselves loyal to the Jacobites and to no one else, or to James and no one else, the government signs the Habeas Corpus Suspension Act of 1715. Basically what this does is the government officially takes any land that is owned by any person swearing allegiance to King James. It strips them of their land, it strips them of their titles, and it then puts that land in the hands of loyalists. There were two major battles. Actually, I'm going to go back a little bit before I get there. There were two major battles in the Rising of the 15. The first one is at Sheriff Mohr. It's an interesting one to talk about from a military perspective. I am not a military historian, but the majority of the literature says that it was a very inconclusive battle. The Jacobites may or may not have won, and they may or may not have retreated at the same time. There is debate on how the militaries of both sides truly moved on the field and whether or not the Jacobites were falling back to recoup or were completely retreating from the field. So it was weird, but eventually, effectively, Sheriff Mohr stops the Jacobites from moving further south. South from where? All of the north of Scotland, because the Rising of the 15 started off very strong. The Jacobites actually take control of the majority of northern Scotland, north of what is called the Firth of Forth, which essentially is the dividing line between the highlands and the lowlands. The other major battle of 15 was the Battle of Preston. The Battle of Preston is, depending on how you term it, the last battle fought on English soil. There's a lot of debate over what the true last battle on English soil was, but this has probably got one of the better claims to that. In the Battle of Preston, there was a commander by the name of William McIntosh, the Fourth of Borlum, sometimes termed the Old Fox. And William McIntosh of Borlum is a direct descendant, or excuse me, a direct ancestor of some of the Scots that would later settle here. And interestingly, with the Battle of Preston, the English and Irish soldiers who were fighting alongside the Scots all tried to wave the white flag early and give up the battle. And the British military refused to accept their surrender until the Scots agreed to surrender with no conditions. It was another day until the Scots agreed to do so. Now, arguably the most important outcome of the Rising of the 15 were these two acts, so the disarming acts of 1716 and 1725. They made it unlawful for any Highlander to bear arms, be that a firearm, a musket, a sword, or the targe, the traditional shield of the Highlanders. It also forbids feudal service as a form of land payment, which was a major portion of the rights of the clan leader, was to accept as a form of payment for lands service. The Disarming Act of 1725 was a doubling down of the one of 1716. Basically, they reinforced the exact same institutions, and then they also placed Field Marshal George Wade to oversee that. George Wade was an English military officer who was put in the Highlands to oversee the disarming acts because the Scots were flaunting the fact that they were still carrying firearms. George Wade actually would go to individual houses and strip them of firearms and take away their swords and targes if he found them, even if they were just on display. He was a bit strict. Wade also had this amazing idea to build roads between the various garrison forts, including Fort William that we talked about earlier, and the lowlands, which opened up the economy of the Highlands outside of this isolated area in which they had been living. So, carrying on after 1715, we get to 1719. 1719 is an interesting one in the fact that this is the only time that the Jacobites get supported by Spain. There's a reason this is the only time Spain tries to help the Jacobites. It didn't go well at all at any point in time. Most notably, at the Battle of Glenshiel, the English and the Hanoverians would bring, or would become the Hanoverians later, would bring 4 cohorn mortars. Seen here is the one we have on display at Fort King George. This is the very first time that the Scots had ever encountered a cohorn mortar, which essentially is an old-timey grenade launcher. The British officers bring in the cohorns, set them down, and begin lobbing grenades at the lines of the Spanish and Jacobite armies. The Spanish were in the middle, and the Jacobites were on the side. And as the grenades start falling and the heather catches on fire, the Jacobites break and run into the mountains, leaving the Spanish to be slaughtered and captured. (1721) is, as strange as this sounds, probably one of my favorite of these. It's called the Atterbury plot, or the Atterbury assassination plot. It is the closest the Jacobites come to succeeding outside of the Rising of the 15 and the later 45. And part of that was because it ran, one, very secretly, and two, based on public outrage. We talk about here at Fort King George this little issue called the South Sea Bubble, which was a major economic crash in all of England. The South Sea Bubble crash made everyone lose money, including every member of parliament, the king himself, the country itself, the national banks. And people were really upset. And capitalizing on the anger and outrage at King George I, based on this bubble crash, several lords and ladies, possibly but not completely certainly involving James Oglethorpe's mother, began to devise plans to assassinate King George on his way while going from the palace to the parliament. And it almost works. In fact, if one guy hadn't started talking really loudly in France about how well this was going to work, it probably would have worked. But that one guy opened his mouth in the wrong direction, and it got back to loyalists in England. Actually, it got back via the French, who were trying to buy their good graces of the King of England at this point in time. And finally, there's the rising of the 45. This is probably the most famous of the risings. It's the one that's often depicted in the literature, most famously in Outlander. This is the rising that culminates at the Battle of Culloden, and it is truly the last time that the Stuarts attempt to take the throne. There are some little attempts here and there. None of them are endorsed by the Stuarts after this one. So that was a crash course on the Jacobites and Jacobite Risings. If I haven't lost you yet, you're in good company. So the other major factor was the economy of the Highlands. So prior to 1707, the Highlanders really just relied on farming for themselves and herding cattle. There was almost no currency known in Scotland at this point in time. Everything was done on a barter system or was done on an agreement to one another that the debts would be settled eventually, that we would make even with each other. With 1707, or before 1707, the clans were very strong in enforcing this form of economy. We'll talk a little bit more about the changing clan system as well. But beginning in 1707, under the Acts of Union, which brings Scotland and England together, there's now an increased trade between England and Scotland. And that involves a completely new form of economy. England was a cash economy, very, very currency-based. And Scotland, again, was not. So this meeting of ideas was hard put. So after 1707, the Highland economy begins to shift. It has to move to a cash-based economy so that it can compete and work alongside the English one. Subsistence farming kind of goes away. You have these small crofters, as they're called, who still grow a little bit of their own food, but that is only the poorest of folk now, as opposed to everyone. The timber trade makes a major rise with especially the mining industry needing more coal and charcoal to burn and needing the timber for framing of shafts and things like that. Particularly around the area of Inverness, the timber trade shoots off. Now, with a shifting economy, you get a shifting culture. I mentioned that there is, pre-1707, the clan system was extremely strong. The clan system I will say, probably had been in a little bit of a decline before that, but when the economy shifts, it takes a nosedive. And what that means is there is less of a nuclear family idea. You have a spreading and an individualism that begins to crop up in the Highlands, which had been less emphasized before that. The traditional lifeways begin to change as well. I talked about how subsistence farming is on the decline, how the timber industry is taking over. The cattle industry is now more focused on raising to sell rather than raising to keep. This also limits the Highlanders' leisure time. As a subsistence farmer, as a crofter, as a herder, we had a lot of downtime. And the gentlemen would use that downtime to train, especially in areas of battle and in what they were considered feats of manliness. This is the origin of the Highland Games, and when you're trying to toss a bale of hay as high as you can, or trying to throw a tree end over end to cross that creek. There's less time for that now when you're driven by nothing but cash. When you're trying to cut down those trees and get them loaded rather than cut down those trees so you can get across the creek. Another big issue with the shifting culture of Scotland was the creation of the Society in Scotland for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge. This was a group that went into the Highlands of Scotland with the sole intent of promoting a Protestant form of Christianity and the English language. They opened up schools throughout the whole Highlands that were free to the public to go. The children would then be taught how to read and write in English only. Prior to this, the Scottish Gaelic language was most prominent in the majority of the Highlands, and English was almost unknown. So with the SSPCK, there is another shift away from the Celtic world to the more English Germanic world, which changes the culture a lot. Now, not every clan and every group was excited about this shifting culture. I've got there the clan badge of Clan Mackay, or Clan McKay, which make up nearly a third of the settlers here in Georgia, and they were strict traditionalists. They refused at every occasion to change their way of life to match the shifting culture and the shifting economy. But the Society in Scotland for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge is where the very first minister in Darien would come from. Not that he lasted. He actually ended up fleeing pretty quickly, abandoning the town of Darien. But he was the first minister to come to Darien, and he attempted to teach a little bit of English, but that was actually discouraged. We'll talk about that. So that's why you would leave Scotland. You have the shifting culture, shifting economy, and all of this, backlash from Jacobitism. But why Georgia? Why would you come to the low country of Georgia from the Highlands of Scotland? Well, this one's really got two factors. The first is what we call the Savannah Dilemma, or the Savannah problem. And the second is an extremely successful recruiting campaign. So what is the Savannah Dilemma? Well, Savannah is founded in 1734 by the trustees of Georgia. Particularly, the only trustee to come to Georgia was James Edward Oglethorpe. So you'll often hear me, even right now, you'll hear me talk about Oglethorpe as a proxy for the trustees. Savannah was created as a haven for English debtors. The entire colony of Georgia was supposed to originally help to alleviate the strain on the debtors' prisons back in England, allowed for fine upstanding Protestants to come settle on the frontiers to help add a buffer south of South Carolina between the English there and the Spanish. The biggest problem, however, was it was a haven for English debtors. Most of these people had grown up in cities. they were extremely ill-equipped to survive in a rural frontier environment. The Savannah colony was extremely dependent on goods from South Carolina and from the trustees trying to give them whatever they could. And the military and food from South Carolina. And South Carolina wasn't happy about this. The governor of South Carolina would often write back to the trustees, arguing and bickering about how dependent Savannah was on them. So by 1735, Oglethorpe especially, as well as the rest of the trustees, they're fed up with Savannah. And they're ready to start completely afresh with a new town. And they want this town to be populated by colonists who could both defend the colony and be self-sufficient. That's when we start recruiting the Highlanders. The two men in charge of recruiting in the Highlands were both Scots themselves, both from the Highlands around the area of Inverness. The first was Captain Hugh Mackay, and the other was Captain George Dunbar. If you are a local to this area or if you have been in the coastal area of Georgia, especially if you traveled between Brunswick and St. Simon's Island, you'll recognize the names Mackay and Dunbar because the creeks here are named after them. There are neighborhoods here named after those two people. They're extremely important to this area of the early colony of Georgia. But you can't just say, hey, why don't you come over here? You gotta offer somebody something, right? So they offer food, weapons, livestock, tools, and land. All of these were extremely attractive to the Scots. In fact, it wasn't just a little bit of food. The official offer for any man willing to go, and it was expected that any man who was with a family would bring his family as well. But on the ship, you were guaranteed to have 4 days of beef, 1 day of pork, and 2 days of what they called burgoo, kind of like a Brunswick stew, a mishmash stew of various leftovers. You were also guaranteed 7 pounds of bread per week with beer and water to drink. Once you were on land, every man was granted 672 pounds of corn, 100 pounds of meat, 30 pounds of butter, about 28 pounds of cheese, 50 pounds of salt to get you through the first year. You were also granted a musket, a broadsword, and an axe. If you were a gentleman, a fine upstanding individual, you'd also be granted a targe or a shield. And 50 acres worth of land, which was held in what they called tail mail. So your male heirs would then be allowed to take over the 50 acres. This actually caused a lot of problems among the Scottish Highlanders because in Scotland, women were allowed to inherit land. It was not heard of in England. So later, during a later recruiting period, they would change it to tail general, so any of your children could inherit your land. Also, for every 5 men that settled in this new place, they were granted a cow, a calf, a sow or a female pig, a brass kettle, a shovel, and a pick. Now, that's if you could pay your own way. You could also come over as an indentured servant. The indentured servants actually got all of the same benefits as if you could pay your own way, with the expectation that when they got here, they would serve a certain amount of time in servitude. If you were 19 years or older, that term was for 5 years. So after your 5 years, you wouldn't get 50 acres, you would get 20 acres, but you got all of the food and all of the weapons and things that were granted to you. If you're 18 years old or younger, you had to serve until you were 24. But at the same time, as soon as you turned 24, you got all of the same goods granted to you. Now, they had an idea of what their ideal recruit would be. They expected the recruits that Mackay and Dunbar would bring would be from gentlemen's families. They wanted people who were educated to some degree or another, were well respected, and had been trained in a military sense. They wanted people of good reputation. They didn't want troublemakers. They had enough of those in Savannah. They wanted people who were industrious and laborious, or laborious rather. People who were willing to put in the work and had proven that they could. They were to be brave, whatever that means. And they were also expected to be speakers of Scottish Gaelic. And the idea was that the trustees were going to take something that had been common among the Highlanders for a long time, that clan system. And instead of having a new clan chief, they would place themselves or their agent as the head of this new Darien clan. And they were recruiting people to be members of that society. They wanted those Scottish Gaelic speakers because they also didn't want them to be able to run away to South Carolina. So by bringing people who don't speak English, they're going to have a harder time getting somewhere else. So who comes? Actually, a lot of people. The first ship to come over had over 100 passengers on it. Among them were 7 John McIntoshes. That is 7 different individuals named John McIntosh. They came from a variety of clans, but most primarily, they came from a confederation of clans or an overarching clan. This is the badge here of Clan Catton. From Clan Catton, there comes members of Clan McIntosh. There is Clan McGillivray, Clan McQueen, McPherson, and McBain or McBean. From outside of Clan Catton, we have the Frasers, the McLeans, Grants, Mackays, and McDonald's. This is a different form of the Mackay badge from a different area, and the McDonald's. One great line from the book, The Scottish Highlanders of Colonial Georgia, really emphasizes what this first ship looked like. On board ship was a mixture of people preparing to make a new start in a new world. Ardent Jacobites and strong supporters of the Hanoverian government, Episcopalians and Presbyterians, a mariner, a surgeon, 3 tailors, 1 joiner, 1 weaver, 4 men listed as gentlemen, 25 farmers, 75 named as servants or laborers, a minister, and a complement of women and children that made up the families. This was not what we had seen with the settlement of Fort King George, where it was just the soldiers that would show up and were expected to maintain a fort. This was the settlement of an entirely new society. So what did that look like? No matter what Augusta tries to tell you, we are Georgia's second city here in Darien. The first ship spends 3 months at sea. She docks in Savannah on January the 10th of 1736. That's the name of the ship, the Prince of Wales. When she docks in Savannah, Hugh Mackay and a few men grab small boats called piraguas, and they head down from Savannah to this land that I'm standing on right now, what they had termed as Barnwell's Bluff, what we call the Lower Bluff today, which was the original site of Fort King George. The documents actually say that they found the shells and remains of what was left of Fort King George. And they set up camp there for the night. They decided this was not the place that they were going to set up their town. They moved about a mile inland. Roughly, we believe, close to where Highway 17 comes into Darien along the historic waterfront. By February the 22nd, Oglethorpe makes his first visit to the town of New Inverness, which is what they originally called this town. Oglethorpe arrives in full Highland outfit. He has donned the full kilt, the claymore or the broadsword, a targe, a bonnet with the eagle feather marking him as a chieftain or a chief. And supposedly, he was confident enough in it that when he arrived and stepped off the boat, the Scots began asking where was General Oglethorpe. They wanted to see this leader of their society, and they at first did not believe it when the other soldiers pointed to Oglethorpe in his Highland garb. The other famous story, which may or may not be apocryphal, of Oglethorpe visiting Darien was that he refused to sleep in the tents of the gentlemen. There were almost no buildings created yet in Darien. Instead, he asked where the soldiers were sleeping. And when they indicated a large oak tree and they had their plaids wrapped around them, Oglethorpe then went, sat down, and did the same. So what was Darien at that point in time? Of course, they'd only been here for a little over a month. Well, the men had constructed a battery, including 4 cannons. They had constructed a guardhouse, a storehouse, a chapel, and a few huts, and one house. That one house was built for a woman who actually lost her husband on the boat ride over. As a new widow, that was the gift of this new town to her, was the very first house built here. The rest of the houses had to wait until after the planting fields were finished. That was the decision of the men there. They wanted to plant before they could build their houses. By March, Savannah and Darien were connected by a road. Oglethorpe actually references those roads that I mentioned earlier, built by Field Marshal Wade, as an inspiration for the connecting roads between Savannah and Darien. He wanted to make sure that trade was open in every direction possible. Also, interestingly enough, this road roughly lies along the same path as Highway 17. So that path between here and Savannah has been here for a long time. In that same month, the fort is actually completed. Fort Darien, we unfortunately don't know very much about. We have no idea what the size or shape or anything was, but we do know that it included 12 cannons, which for as small as a fort as it would have had to have been, 12 cannons would have been an extreme defensive position. Because of the decision to wait on building the houses to prepare the planting fields, the harvest of 1736 is a great harvest. It's so good that the people of Darien can't eat all of the corn that they've grown and actually sell the rest of it off to Savannah. But this is the last time they have a good harvest. The soils here are poor, to say the least. Several years of bad weather and a plague of rats at one point in time ensures that there's no more good planting. Darien was not without its struggles. There was a constant fear of Spanish attack. In fact, the first rumors of a Spanish attack begin in 1737. There are reports and claims that as early as March, the Spanish will be overtaking this new area of Georgia. And they're not entirely wrong. In April, 16 Spanish land on Amelia Island to attack a small fort that Oglethorpe had been building that was housing Highlanders from Darien. The Spanish were turned around and repelled fairly easily, but 7 of them make it up to Darien and open fire on the fort. The Highlanders returned fire and might have injured one of them, but they never found him. The winter of 1736, going into 1737, is extremely rough. It does create the community and creates a leader in the community. His name is John Mohr McIntosh. But by the fall of 1737, the situation is so dire that Darien actually the members of Darien march to Frederica on St. Simon's Island and demand help with food. Fort Frederica has nothing to offer, so they actually sent John Mohr McIntosh and a few others out on a boat to go intercept a ship that was captained by Dunbar to take their provisions so that the town would survive. Then in 1738, there's a drought. The drought leads to a massive crop failure, both at Darien and at Fort Frederica. And at this point in time, Darien issues demands to Oglethorpe. They actually are planning to send a party into South Carolina to claim their own lands. But John McIntosh of Clinvilke actually decides he's going to go to Oglethorpe first. This is not John Mohr McIntosh, it's one of the other John McIntoshes. And he says, we need relief, we need help. Things are tough. We can't keep our own land. The soil is terrible. There's no market here for anything else. We don't have a timber market. We don't have a cattle market. We don't even have credit to our names. So what they do is they actually request a public store be built in Darien. Prior to this, the only store was in Savannah. And at that store, they say that they don't want to be able to pay in money. They want to be able to pay in goods, especially sawn lumber. Oglethorpe agrees. He's afraid that he's going to lose Darien. So he agrees to grant the store, and he also sends an extra 2 cows and a calf and 1 breeding mare. So trying to appease the Highlanders as much as possible. There are economic and social issues, kind of covered that a little bit there with the lack of the market, the lack of credit. And there's also the accusations of mismanagement, especially by John Mohr McIntosh himself. John Mohr McIntosh begins training the military troops here in Darien in March of 1737. And by July of 1738, there is an open complaint about John Mohr McIntosh's harshness, his unfair treatment. By January of 1739, the store is finally built. There are a few other buildings built in Darien, but John Mohr McIntosh is actually accused of not paying the workers and also mismanaging the store, not giving people the value that he should have been giving them. The entire town of Darien threatens to leave not once, but twice. So like I said, in 1738, they applied for a land grant in South Carolina and were getting ready to leave until the store was built. And then, because things didn't improve, by 1739, a delegation is actually sent to New York and attempts to get a grant there. Those 2 instances are both times where the entire town attempts to leave. But all along that same time period, people are just leaving. Some of them move back to Savannah. Some of them move into Savannah. The man who's listed as a joiner or a carpenter actually goes and takes over a plot in Savannah from his brother. Several of them go to South Carolina. Some of them actually return to Scotland. And then there is the influence and reaction to the malcontents of Savannah. The malcontents in Savannah, I won't go into too much of them, but basically they caused a lot of problems. They were, as the name implies, not happy. They were largely lowland Scots as well. So there's a little bit of a cultural influence there. While lowland Scots and Highland Scots traditionally don't get along, Scots get along better with English. Scots get along with themselves better than they do with the English. The malcontents also served as a scapegoat for pretty much anything bad that happened in colonial Georgia, especially if Secretary William Stevens was involved. However, one of the most egregious things that the malcontents did is they actually wrote up a petition to the trustees in an attempt to bring slavery into the colony of Georgia, which had been originally 100% forbidden. The malcontents looked across the Savannah River at the plantations of South Carolina and wished that they could own that kind of land and have people other than themselves to work it. As a response, the settlers of Darien, as well as the Salzburger, the German settlers of Ebenezer, both wrote counter petitions against this idea. The petition of the inhabitants of New Inverness to His Excellency General Oglethorpe argues against the introduction of slavery from economic standpoints, from a security standpoint. This was especially true with the fact that the Stono Rebellion had just occurred in South Carolina not that long ago. The Stono Rebellion was a slave revolt that ended in many of the enslaved individuals who had been serving in South Carolina to flee to Spanish Florida, where they were granted their own freedom and were set up to serve at their own fort, their own town, where they could live by themselves. But most interestingly, from the point of view of a humanitarian issue, in fact, it's one of the earliest British sources to do such. And here's an excerpt from it. It is shocking to human nature that any race of mankind and their posterity should be sentenced to perpetual slavery, nor in justice can we think otherwise of it. Then they are thrown amongst us to be our scourge on day or other for our sins. And as freedom must be as dear to them as to us, what a scene of horror must it bring about. And the longer it is unexecuted, the bloody scene must be the greater. There is some evidence that the signing of the petition to combat slavery in Georgia was a bit strong-handed by both Oglethorpe and John Mohr Mackintosh. Certainly, it was not written in a Scottish hand. The wording was mostly delivered to them. But the fact that it was agreed upon and was signed is still extremely significant. So who's here in Darien? What's it look like here? The men of Darien were assigned into what is called the Highland Independent Company of Darien. They are the very first kilted military unit to be based outside of the British Isles. They're also the very first military unit in the entire British Army to be issued the Brown Bess musket, which is the form of weaponry, the musket that would be used by the British military for over 100 years. There is some debate over how their uniforming looked, and I would be amiss by my Highland Independent Company reenactors if I did not bring that up. So the black and white image that you see here is a depiction from a few years after the fact of a Highland Independent Company back in Scotland. And there's also the interpretation of our reenactors here. I'm not going to get into the debate, but there's good evidence on both sides, in my opinion. Highland Independent Companies were not a new idea. They had been around for a long time, and they had been banned and then reinstated in 1725 under Field Marshal Wade. Highland Independent Companies were essentially patrol groups that would look over their local areas of the Scottish Highlands. They were usually kilted. They were issued weapons and firearms. They were the only ones that are allowed to carry firearms under Wade's orders. And several of them would last. The Highland Independent Companies would become numbered military units in later British military, including one of the more famous ones, the Black Watch, which we'll get to talk a little bit about today too. But some little interesting things there. But why do I bring up the Highland Independent Company? Well, Highlanders have to go to war. Officially, the War of Jenkins' Ear begins on October 23rd, 1739. I am not a military historian. I am going to try to not go too deep into the military history. I'm going to save that for someone who is. Mr. Larry Ivers will be our presenter in the December talk. He is an expert in British military tactics and history. So October 23rd, 1739, Parliament declares war on Spain due to the fact that a sailor named, I think his name is Robert Jenkins, gets his ear cut off by the Spanish Navy. Supposedly, the image here we see is supposedly him presenting his ear before Parliament, and some of the lords are fainting and the ladies are just sipping their tea. But what really happens, what really makes things happen here, is not long after the official declaration of war, Spanish arrive back on Amelia Island, and they kill 2 of the Scottish soldiers that are stationed there. After that, every able-bodied man of Darien was drafted in the Independent Highland Company, which leaves Darien entirely stripped of men. Oglethorpe goes on the offensive. He wants to try and beat the Spanish at their own game. He takes his Redcoat Regiment, the 42nd of the Foot, the Highland Rangers, the Highland Independent Company, several native allies, and some backup troops from South Carolina, and they march on Florida. And they do a good job. They take Fort Picoletta almost immediately. Then they move on to Fort San Francisco de Puebla, and then Fort San Diego, which was across the creek from them. And finally, they make it all the way to Fort Mose, which was that fort that had been given to the enslaved individuals that had fled from South Carolina. Now, some interesting things happen here in the middle of this campaign. One of them is that one of the leaders of the Scottish regiments, in fact, of the Scottish Rangers, Aeneas McIntosh, gets a letter from Scotland telling him that he needs to return because he has just inherited the chieftainship of Clan McIntosh and Clan Catton. So he has to turn around and make good on all his debts and sail back to Scotland. He leaves his fort, Fort Plachicola, to his brother, John McIntosh. It's a different John McIntosh. So Fort Mose, back in Florida, it's being held pretty well. There is a mix of the South Carolina English, the natives, and the Scots. But the Scots and the English don't ever get along about anything. So they're openly arguing with one another. The leaders of both troops are constantly bickering back and forth about everything, including where they should be sleeping. The English want to sleep out in the earthworks of the fort on the outside of the walls, while the Scots set up tents inside the walls trying to protect themselves, which means the gates have to stay open so there's free passage between the 2 groups. Well, then the Spanish decide they're going to take back their fort. They march with 300 soldiers against what is approximately 140 British forces. The morning of the attack, the Scots were inside the fort, and they were at a complete state of chaos and undress. Lieutenant Mackay, when the battle begins, is actually found in nothing but his undershirt, his very short breeches, and some stockings, carrying his musket and his claymore. That's it. As the Spanish take the fort, Mackay actually grabs hold of William McIntosh, who is John Mohr McIntosh's oldest son, and he cuts his way through the Spanish with his claymore, jumps off the walls, and flees into the woods. John Mohr McIntosh was not so lucky. Him and 15 other Highlanders are taken captive by the Spanish. They were actually the lucky ones. The majority of the Highlanders who had marched on Florida actually die at what has become known as the slaughter at Fort Mose. You'll notice on the slide there, I've got 3 different spellings of Mose, whether it's Mose or Musa or Moza. It's because the English and Spanish didn't, the English are terrible at trying to translate Spanish words. So you'll see that one in a bunch of different forms of literature. So that is a big hit to the Darien Highlanders. And that leads to more troubles. So John Mohr McIntosh, like I said, had been captured by the Spanish. He's held in St. Augustine for 3 months. He is then sent to Havana, Cuba, and finally he is sent to a prison in San Sebastian in Spain. That cripples his family. The family now has no way of making money, and a lot of people didn't like John Mohr McIntosh, so they're not really helping out. William, who had been saved by Lieutenant Mackay, actually stays at Frederica and is taken care of by Oglethorpe himself. The younger brother, the next one in line, Lachlan, and the oldest daughter, Anne, are actually sent to Bethesda Orphanage, which is now Bethesda Academy in Savannah, and are put up as orphans for the care of the trustees. John Mohr McIntosh's wife, Margaret, and their 4 other kids flee to Palachucola, and there they rely on the goodwill of a different John McIntosh and Secretary Stevens. Had it not been for those 2, it would have been a very different story. Of the original 250 settlers of New Inverness or Darien, there are only about 53 people left in town. And of that, 2/3 of them are women and children. Reverend MacLeod, who had come with the Scottish Society that I mentioned earlier, he actually now leaves. He says that there's not enough people here to even sustain the town, and he goes to South Carolina. Well, Oglethorpe takes that to heart, and he goes back recruiting. Actually sends Mackay and Dunbar back again to the Highlands of Scotland to bring in more people. And they do. They bring in a new ship called the Loyal Judith. She carries 43 Highlanders, of which only 2 speak English, as well as timber working tools, saws, axes, hammers, and more muskets. Every man 21 years or older would get a 50-acre lot held in tail general, so pass along to any of his children, as well as regular payments for the first year. He didn't get the food that the first group had gotten. They're getting paid. Of the 43 Highlanders that show up, 12 of them were Mackays, and 2 more were married into the clan Mackay. They are largely supporters of the Hanoverian government. So they're largely supporters of King George, as opposed to the earlier group that were largely Jacobites. Interestingly enough, they land in Savannah in December of 1741, but Secretary Stevens refuses to let them off the boat. He's terrified that the malcontents will get to them and will tell them all these horrible things, so they are forced to wait on the boat until smaller boats can come and take them down to Darien. Also, in 1741, the economy picks up. Cattle goes in high demand. The timber industry starts to flourish. This is actually the timber industry this is the establishment of the timber industry that would thrive in Darien for the next almost 200 years. We will have a speaker on that in 2 months, talking about the timber industry here in Darien and why that was so important. But this is where it begins, right here in 1741. But the war's not over. Now it's the Spanish's turn. They come to Georgia. In the end of June 1742, they set sail out of St. Augustine with 52 men of war, so large warships. And they are aiming for St. Simon's Island, where there is Fort St. Simon's and Fort Frederica. Everyone that is left in Darien is evacuated. All of the women and the children are sent north to Fort Palachucola, and the men are all sent to Frederica to bolster the garrison there. And then on the 7th of July, 2 units of Spanish soldiers are seen within 1.5 miles of Fort Frederica. Again, I'm not going into all the military history here. I'll leave that to Larry Ivers. But these 2 units of Spanish are chased off by Oglethorpe, the Highland Independent Company, a couple Rangers, and a couple natives. They flee for nearly, or they chase them for nearly 3 miles. And over the course of that 3-mile chase, the Spanish lose 36 soldiers. Oglethorpe loses 1. The Highlander, he died of heat exhaustion. That is what we call the Battle of Gully Hole Creek. But the more famous is the Battle of Bloody Marsh. At the Battle of Bloody Marsh, about 60 soldiers of the Redcoat Company, the 42nd, and about 50 Highlanders lay a trap across the road between the Spanish camp and Fort Frederica. Somewhere between 150 to 200 Spanish begin to march north back to Fort Frederica and wander into this trap. It doesn't go well for the Spanish. The British open fire, and the Spanish return fire, which sends the Redcoats fleeing. The Redcoats actually, the 42nd unit retreats, but the Scots do not. They continue to fire and eventually drop their muskets and lead what is called the Highland Charge, where they are no longer under firearms, they are drawing swords, pulling on their targes, and chasing after the Spanish. Oglethorpe, who had gone back to Frederica to bring in more men for this trap, finds the 42nd, his Redcoats, about 2 miles away from the battle, turns them around to march back, and finds that it need to. The Spanish are gone. In fact, they flee off of St. Simon's and all the way back to St. Augustine. Only about 12 Spanish were killed in the Battle of Bloody Marsh, but it was seen as a major victory and a revenge for what had been done at Fort Mose. Also, this essentially ends the War of Jenkins' Ear in Georgia. And with the end of the War of Jenkins' Ear, the Spanish threat goes away. And there's another shift. In August of 1742, Margaret McIntosh and all of the children return to Darien. So Lachlan and Anne come out of Bethesda. William actually returns to Darien as well. And John Mohr McIntosh returns somewhere in the summer of 1743 and immediately takes the town back over, puts himself right back in charge. The town of Darien is again bolstered by more Highlanders when 38 members of the Black Watch, at the time was the 43rd Regiment of the Foot Highlanders, they're shipped to Darien following a large-scale mutiny back in Britain. The Black Watch soldiers were actually marched from Fort William in the Highlands down to London, and what they were originally told was going to be a King's inspection. So they're basically marching on parade. And as they get closer and closer to London, they realize that they're about to get shipped over into Flanders, and they did not sign up for overseas battle. So they all turn around and start walking back to Scotland. Over 100 of them are captured. Only 4 of them, including the man pictured here, Farquhar Shaw, were executed rather. The rest of those that were captured were dispersed across the globe. Some of them were sent to India, some of them were sent down to the Caribbean, and 38 of them landed here in Darien. In July of 1743, Oglethorpe gets recalled to Britain. He will never again return to Georgia, which he actually opines about later. Interestingly enough, as he's loading onto the boat, actually as they stop in Savannah, he notices he has 2 stowaways on board. It's 2 of John Mohr McIntosh's sons, William and Lachlan. They had heard rumors of what would be the rising of the 45, and like their father and uncles before them, they decided they wanted to go fight for Prince Charlie, to go fight for the Stuarts. Oglethorpe was the child of extremely staunch Jacobites. And the story goes that he himself sat the two boys down and explained to them that the Stuart line was done. It was time for them to move on, and sent them back to Darien. Probably a good thing, because in the 45, the McIntoshes ended up straddling both sides of the war and not faring great in either direction. And then finally, as the last real note of the Highland Independent Company, in 1749, the 42nd of the Foot, which is Oglethorpe's Redcoat division, was officially disbanded. Interestingly enough, this is what makes the Black Watch take over the numbering of the 42nd, which they would have until just a few years ago. The men of that unit were offered 50 acres and 1 year of supplies for their service. It's never really stated when the independent company, the Highland Independent Company, is officially disbanded, but it's probably a good guess that it was also disbanded in 49 with the disbanding of the 42nd. But of course, that's not the end of Darien. In 1750, on the 15th of August, slavery is officially introduced into Georgia. Lachlan McIntosh, who was the second son of John Mohr McIntosh, who had been a signer of that earlier petition, actually goes on to become one of the largest rice planters in the entire region and enslaved many individuals. So we actually don't have a good count. But given the amounts of lands that he held, it would have been a very large number. And this was true in a lot of families in the colony of Georgia, where one generation had been very anti-slavery and the next generation becomes large owners. In 1754, the trusteeship of Georgia ends, and the land deeds and everything else that are associated with the colony of Georgia are then transferred to the Parliament and to the King himself. That changes a few things in the way Georgia is run, including removing a lot of the restrictions the trustees had placed on it earlier. In 1760, interestingly enough, we have a document that's talking about the town of Darien, and it calls for the rebuilding of the town. It calls for the building of a new town where the old town once stood. We don't really know what had happened between 1750 and 1760 for the town to have become so decrepit that a new town had to be constructed. But we do know that that new town was built on top of the original town, following mostly the same plan and expanding it outward. And that town is what makes up the majority of the modern historic Darien. Today, out of the 5,687 residents of McIntosh County, about 10% claim direct descendancy from Scotland. Several families here can still recount to you how they are related to those earliest settlers. And that family tradition has not ended. Of course, we are named after Clan McIntosh and the McIntoshes that would go on to serve in various roles here. Lachlan McIntosh, of course, being one of the most famous, not only for his huge land ownership, but also for shooting Button Gwinnett, who was one of the Georgia signers of the Declaration of Independence. Several of the others would fight in the, several McIntoshes would fight in the Revolutionary War. Several of them would fight in the Confederate War, or excuse me, in the Civil War, on both sides for the Union and the Confederacy. And several of them have continued that same tradition. And that is the true Mohr of the story. So I want to open up the floor now. If you have any other questions that you haven't passed along yet, whether you're in the Facebook Live or whether you are in the Zoom, we have a couple people here. We have two of our Rangers here fielding those. So if you've got them, go ahead and pass them along.
All right, that was a great presentation, Michael. Thank you for going over all of that information about our Scottish heritage here in Darien. We just have a couple of comments and questions. You mentioned that time of struggle, those years in early Darien, where there was crop failure and all of these other things. Our former site manager, Ken Akins, actually commented pretty interested in that information, and was wondering if you had any more information to give on that time there.
Yeah, that's an interesting time period as far as like that early settlement in 1737, going through 38 and 39. Or my notes on it. A lot of the information that I pulled on that time period came from from my source was the Scottish Highlanders of Coastal Georgia book. But they actually make a lot of references directly from the colonial records, and especially Secretary Stevens's journals, both of which are in publication with the Georgia Historical Society. But yeah, we had an extremely harsh winter in 1736, leading into 1737, and it's possible that it may have actually even snowed here. It most likely snowed in Savannah, according to some of the records, but it may have snowed here as well, which was as unexpected then as it is now. Of course, we know that the climate was a touch cooler then. There was a bit of a mini ice age going on. But they still weren't expecting it to get that cold. Of course, the Highlanders were ready for it, but their crops were not. And then it was immediately followed by the drought in 38, which must have gotten pretty dire because Fort Frederica, the documents from Captain Horton, who was still at Fort Frederica, he hadn't moved down to Jekyll yet. He was the quartermaster there, so he was in charge of all the provisions. He writes in his journals that they were afraid that they would not be able to feed the people. And then again, in 39, no, it's in 38 rather, the little bit that is harvested is completely overrun by an infestation of rats coming in off the marsh, who had probably been affected by their own loss of food supply. So anything that had been stored was steadily getting destroyed, which doesn't make for a good situation to be in when you're on the frontiers. One of the struggles too that I didn't mention, but I feel like I would be amiss not to, was just learning how to deal with the wildlife here. In 1737, John Mohr McIntosh actually loses one of his sons to an alligator attack. Two of the boys are out bathing in the creek, or in the river rather, and an alligator takes one of the boys. He's about 9 years old. And as a side note, I often cite that as probably one of the earliest mentions of what would later become the Altamaha river monster here.
All right, great explanation there. Ken was also wondering, you mentioned that Oglethorpe banned all the Catholics from Georgia, and he was wondering why Oglethorpe did that, because Oglethorpe was open to all other groups, including people of the Jewish faith. So he's wondering why Oglethorpe banned the Catholics.
That's actually a really good question. Oglethorpe didn't have a problem per se with Catholics. In fact, two of his sisters were Catholic. The fear was, it was a security risk. If you had Catholics living in the colony of Georgia, the idea is that they may be more loyal to the Pope than they would be to the king. And if they're more loyal to the Pope, then they may be wanting to support the other Catholic kingdom in North America, namely the Spanish, who were the next group down. The Spanish were very Catholic, and the English wanted to avoid that at all costs. So by keeping the Catholics out of the colony of Georgia, you kept people from wanting to do some backdoor dealings with the Spanish or abandoning the English colony and giving away the information to the Spanish. That's not the only thing that was banned in the trusteeship of Georgia. We should also note that lawyers were banned. There were no lawyers allowed in Georgia. I have not yet found a great explanation as to why. But also there was no hard liquor. beer was a necessity, but rum was supposed to be verboten. Oglethorpe was a very staunch anti-hard liquor fan. And yeah, so it was no slaves, no Catholics, no lawyers, and no drinks were the primary preventions that were all supposed to be economic and social constraints to help build the colony better.
With regards to there not being any slavery allowed, we also got a question from Cassie about what year slavery was introduced to Georgia.
Yeah, slavery was introduced into Georgia in 1751, which was at the, I'll make sure I have that date right. So 1750, the first slaves officially were brought into Georgia in 1751. There were definitely residents of Georgia who owned enslaved individuals prior to that, but they were all housed and mostly worked on the other side of the Savannah River in South Carolina property. But officially, slavery was allowed into Georgia in 1750, and the idea was that the trustees were hemorrhaging money compared to the South Carolina colony, and the idea was by introducing the allowing of enslaved individuals, we could build a plantation economy and compete with our northern neighbors.
All right, we have one more question here. Gay Royal was wondering, the last slide showed a map of the new town, and where is that map on display, or how can it be accessed to view more closely?
So that map, it's a little bit later than the new town. It's, if I remember correctly, it's closer to the 1790s after the establishment of the new country. That map was originally accessed by us on the Georgia Historical Society's website. We also have a copy of it on display here in the museum. But the Georgia Historical Society has a pretty high definition copy that you can get to. It shows a lot of the layout of the town. Do I still have it open? I can get y'all a view of that one again. There we go. Get away all the. So it shows the layout of the town and shows that it's still largely being laid out on what is the Oglethorpe plan, where you've got the large green squares the squares of greenery, rather, surrounded by the lots that are put out in blocks and laid out on this grid system. Most of the ones on this side, this road here is modern day Highway 17. Most of the ones on this side of the road are less visible today, but on the eastern side of Highway 17, on your way to the fort from that direction, a lot of these squares still exist, and several of the lots actually are still laid out the same way.
All right, well, that wraps it up for the questions. Thank you, Michael, for giving this wonderful presentation today. And thank you to all of you all who are watching. We couldn't do this without you, and we're glad that this speaker series is generating some interest in the community. And yeah, thank you all for joining today. Michael, do you have any ending thoughts to add before we wrap up?
I will say, because I saw a handful of people popping in, of course, across the way there, or across the time of the talk. There is a poll that is there. It should pop up on your Zoom screen. We would appreciate a lot if you could fill out that information, because we are being partially funded by a grant. Having that bit of information helps us in doing our paperwork at the end, so maybe we can get a grant again to do some other awesome projects like what we've got planned. But other than that, thank y'all for joining us. I hope y'all have a good day and stay safe out there.